Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto stepped down from the transport train onto snow-packed ground, his torn uniform barely protecting him from the biting cold. Around him, dozens of other Japanese soldiers, hollow-cheeked, exhausted, lips cracked from weeks of short rations, blinked against the pale winter light. Hunger showed in their faces like a brand. Since his first day in the Imperial Army, Yamamoto had been taught one lesson above all others. Capture was shame. Capture was worse than death. He had been warned that Americans would torture prisoners, starve them, humiliate them, until they begged for mercy that would never come. Many had prepared themselves to be struck down the moment they left the train. What Yamamoto didn't know yet was that within hours he would face something more psychologically devastating than any torture. A hamburger on a bun, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and the realization that everything he had been taught about his enemy was a lie. The shock wouldn't come from cruelty. It would come from abundance so casual it seemed like mockery, from kindness that felt more like an attack than any beating could have been. This is the story of how American plenty broke Japanese soldiers more effectively than violence ever could, how hamburgers and Coca-Cola became weapons of psychological warfare more powerful than propaganda, and how POWs returned to a starving Japan haunted not by torture scars, but by the taste of enemy food they couldn't forget. The arrival, expecting death, finding order. What they saw made them hesitate with confusion rather than terror. Rows of wooden barracks stood against the snow. Guard towers, yes, with armed sentries, barbed wire fencing the perimeter. But the atmosphere was not what they had pictured. There was order here, calm, systematic order. Trucks passed through camp roads. Smoke from kitchen chimneys carried the smell of cooking food. Rich, fatty food, far stronger than the weak soups they had lived on for months. Some prisoners exchanged nervous glances, trying to read each other's faces for understanding. Others kept their eyes low, unwilling to betray even a spark of curiosity that might be exploited. Training had taught them to reveal nothing, to accept death without giving captors the satisfaction of seeing fear. Guards shouted commands in English. The tone was firm, not savage. Interpreters stepped forward, Japanese Americans in American uniforms, their very existence confusing the prisoners. How could people of Japanese blood serve America? Were they traitors? Or did their presence suggest something about America that contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught? Line up, the interpreters commanded in Japanese. Move forward in formation. Do not break ranks. You will be processed according to the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention. The prisoners had been told it was Western propaganda, fiction that would be abandoned the moment it became inconvenient. Yet here were Red Cross officials with clipboards observing everything, ensuring rules were followed. One prisoner, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, who had survived Guadalcanal, whispered to the man beside him, "Can this be real? They show us these officials as though laws apply here." His companion, too frightened to answer, simply shook his head. The intake process was mechanical but shocking in its humanity. Men were lined up and directed into a processing building. Inside, they were deloused, their lice-infested uniforms removed and burned immediately. The loss of their uniforms created a moment of profound vulnerability. Some men stood naked and shaking, expecting abuse. Instead, medical personnel conducted examinations. American medics, some clearly uncomfortable working on enemy soldiers, others professionally neutral, checked for fever, measured signs of malnutrition, examined wounds that had been left untreated for weeks or months. A Japanese soldier with an infected bandaged arm expected to be ignored. Instead, an American medic carefully unwrapped the dirty bandage, cleaned the wound with antiseptic that stung but was clearly meant to heal, and applied fresh, clean dressings. Private Hiroshi Matsumoto sat frozen during the procedure, his hands trembling slightly. He could not reconcile this act of care with the image of the barbaric enemy drilled into him through years of training. Why heal an enemy? What purpose did it serve? Was this a trick, healing him only to torture him later when he was stronger? When the medic finished and gestured for Matsumoto to stand, the prisoner remained seated for a moment, staring at the clean white bandage on his arm. It was professional medical work, better than what he had received from his own unit's medics in the field where supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. One prisoner whispered to another in disbelief, Why would they do this? We are not their men. We are nothing, less than nothing. We are defeated enemies who fail to die properly. It must be a trick, his companion replied, eyes downcast. Wait, the cruelty will come. This is to make us lower our guard. The fear lingered despite the absence of violence. Every step felt like it might lead to the punishment they had been told would come. Yet each hour revealed something stranger. Systematic adherence to rules they had been taught were fiction. After registration, the men were marched across the yard to their new quarters. Snow crunched under their boots, new boots from American stores that fit better than their own rotting footwear. The cold cut through their thin, temporary clothes, but they were told better clothing was coming. The barracks were heated with wood stoves. The warmth hit them as they entered, actual warmth, not the barely there heat of jungle campfires. The barracks were lined with bunks, each with a thin mattress and wool blankets. It was not luxury, not home, not freedom, but it was shelter of a quality most hadn't experienced in years. A few prisoners sat heavily on the bunks, testing the mattresses with their palms as though afraid the softness would vanish if they pressed too hard. One man, a corporal who had spent months living in a cave eating roots, lay down fully clothed and stared at the ceiling beams, his expression unreadable. The barracks had rules explained through interpreters. Roll call twice daily. Do not leave without permission. The barbed wire fence was electrified, stated as information, not threat. Escape attempts would be dealt with harshly, but if they followed rules, they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That phrase again, Geneva Convention, repeated like it meant something real. That night, as prisoners lay under real blankets, they could not help but wonder. The guard towers were real. The barbed wire was real. The confinement was real. But the treatment was nothing like what they had been promised. Inside the barracks, as guards left and prisoners were alone, men noticed something they could not ignore. The camp ran like a machine, but not like a torture chamber. It ran with calm efficiency that suggested this was routine, that this was how America actually treated prisoners. Some sat on bunks examining their surroundings carefully. Others lay down immediately, exhausted. A few gathered in small groups, whispering about what they had seen. The medical treatment, one said quietly. They cleaned wounds. They gave medicine. Why? Perhaps they need us alive for labor, another suggested. Healthy workers last longer. But the Red Cross officials, a third interjected. Why allow neutral observers? The prisoners did not relax. Suspicion lived in their chests like a second heartbeat. But as night came, they could not help but wonder if the greatest shock was not captivity itself, but how captivity looked nothing like the nightmare they had braced for. But the true shock would not come with rules or barracks. It would come on a tray in the mess hall, carried by the smell of grilled meat and the promise of something they hadn't tasted in years. The breaking point when food becomes a weapon. The next morning, prisoners woke not to blows or insults, but to a bugle call. The sound startled many, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. They had heard the same sound in their own camps. For a moment, some forgot where they were. Then reality crashed back. They were ordered to the mess hall. Many expected food would be withheld entirely, that starvation would be the method of execution. Others expected spoiled food meant to sicken rather than nourish. Still others expected portions so small they would constitute torture. Hunger had been their constant companion for so long that most could barely remember satisfaction. In the Pacific, especially in the final months as American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines, meals had dwindled to almost nothing. Watery rice so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl through the gruel. Sometimes barley, if they were lucky, occasionally a few pickled vegetables that provided flavor but almost no nutrition. Meat was a rarity so extreme that many soldiers couldn't remember the last time they'd tasted it. Sugar, fats, proteins, these had become mythical concepts. Some prisoners had survived on less than 500 calories per day for months. They had watched their own bodies consume themselves, muscles wasting, bones becoming prominent, teeth loosening from scurvy. They had seen comrades die not from enemy bullets, but from simple starvation. Before the meal came procedures. A Red Cross representative addressed them through an interpreter. The representative was middle-aged with a clipboard, speaking in measured tones. He explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would be fed according to standards comparable to what American soldiers received. They would be housed in facilities that protected them from elements. They would be allowed to write letters home, 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, censored but permitted. They would work, but only under certain conditions. They would not be abused. They would be visited regularly by neutral officials to ensure these rules were respected. The words were met with disbelief so complete it felt physical. Some men lowered their eyes, ashamed that they were hearing this. Others whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what was being said. Private Yuki Takahashi muttered to his neighbor, "They speak of rights, but we are their captives. We are defeated enemies who dishonored ourselves by failing to die. Why would they bother with rights?" The interpreter, overhearing, paused and looked at Takahashi directly. "These are not promises being offered as kindness. These are rules that bind them as much as they protect you. They are legal obligations under international law." The weight of those words hung in the air. Legal obligations, as though law still meant something. Medical checks followed, more thorough than the previous day. A doctor pressed fingers into thin wrists, checking for edema. He examined teeth, finding widespread scurvy. He measured blood pressure and found it dangerously low in many prisoners. Prisoners were weighed, and many came in under 100 pounds despite being adult men of average height. Some were below 90 pounds, walking skeletons held together by will alone. American medics shook their heads quietly at the numbers, exchanging glances that conveyed both pity and discomfort. One corporal muttered to his colleague, "How the hell were they even fighting? These guys look like concentration camp victims." Vitamins were distributed, small chalky tablets that puzzled the men, medicine for enemies. The concept was almost insulting in its kindness. By afternoon, prisoners were given fresh uniforms marked with large PW letters. The garments fit better than their torn remnants. Some prisoners slipped into them slowly, hesitating as though each stitch was a surrender of identity. Others embraced the warmth immediately. The guards were another surprise. Yes, they were armed, strict, watchful, but they did not spit on prisoners or strike them for moving too slowly. When one elderly prisoner stumbled on icy path, a guard reached down and pulled him up by the arm. No kick, no sneer, just a curt nod before walking on. It was deeply confusing. That night, the smell from the kitchens was overwhelming. Thick, rich, fatty, not the sour, thin soups they knew. Something whole, something filling. Their stomachs growled involuntarily, betraying them. The line to the mess hall moved slowly the next day. Steam rose from serving trays behind the counter, carrying a scent so foreign to Japanese noses that many couldn't identify it. It was meat, yes, but thicker, heartier, richer than anything they'd known. The smell was smoky, fatty, with undertones of char from grilling. The prisoners clutched their tin trays like shields, waiting for humiliation. That was what they expected. Then the first soldier stepped forward to the serving line. An American cook, sleeves rolled to his elbows, face flushed from kitchen heat, dropped a hot patty onto a soft bun with a spatula. The meat was thick, obviously beef, grilled until the outside was crispy and dark. Then came fried potatoes on the side, golden, glistening with oil. Finally, the cook reached for a glass bottle sweating with condensation, popped the metal cap, and slid it onto the tray. The bottle showed dark liquid with bubbles rising. The red script on the label was unfamiliar. Coca-Cola. Private Saburo Nakamura stared at the tray as if it were a trick. His hand trembled as he gripped the tray edges. He had not held this much food at one time in over a year. "Move along," the cook said flatly, without anger or contempt. Nakamura shuffled forward, still staring. Behind him, whispers rippled, "Meat. They're giving us meat." When more trays began to fill, disbelief deepened. The bun was soft to the touch, actual bread, white and pillowy. The potatoes were fried golden. And the bottle, Coca-Cola, a guard explained, fizzed as though alive. Prisoners sat at long wooden tables. They placed trays down carefully, almost reverently, and simply stared. Some were afraid to eat, convinced this was a test. Others were paralyzed by cognitive dissonance. A few brought the Coca-Cola bottle to their lips cautiously. The liquid hit their tongues and the reaction was immediate. The sweetness exploded first, sugar in quantities their bodies hadn't processed in months. Then came the burn of carbonation, the fizzing bubbles overwhelming their throats. Some gagged, coughing from the shock. Others widened their eyes in astonishment. One man laughed an uncontrolled burst that startled his neighbors. Another covered his mouth and lowered his head, shoulders shaking, caught between laughter and tears. Private Kenzo Hayashi, ribs visible even under his new uniform, lifted his hamburger with both hands. He sniffed it, then bit in. Grease ran down his chin immediately. He froze mid-chew, his jaw working slowly. Salt and char and fat and protein, tastes his body recognized at some primal level as exactly what it desperately needed. He swallowed hard, feeling the food hit his stomach, then lowered his face to hide tears that welled up. "Are you all right?" his bunkmate asked. Hayashi swallowed hard, fighting composure. "I had forgotten," he whispered, voice breaking. "I had forgotten the taste of fat, of meat. I had forgotten food could taste like this." At another table, two prisoners debated in low voices. "They want to make us weak," one argued, voice harsh. "They fatten us like pigs so we forget our cause. This food is meant to soften us." His companion, an older corporal, said slowly, thoughtfully, "Or perhaps they simply eat like this every day. Perhaps this is normal for them." That idea hung in the air between them, more disturbing than any accusation could be. The possibility that this wasn't special treatment, wasn't propaganda or psychological warfare, but was simply routine. That American soldiers, American civilians ate hamburgers and drank Coca-Cola as a matter of course. The mess hall filled with sounds that hadn't been heard in these men's lives for months. Chewing that was slow because rushing wasn't necessary. Muffled laughter from someone still amazed by Coca-Cola's fizz. An occasional sob quickly hidden from men overwhelmed by abundance after starvation. One prisoner later whispered to his bunkmate that the sweetness of Coca-Cola felt like a dream gone wrong, too gentle to belong in war. To the Americans serving the food, this was routine. Standard POW rations. They ate the same hamburgers and fries, washed it down with the same Coke, and thought nothing of it. It was Tuesday lunch. Nothing special, but for the prisoners, this casual abundance was devastating in ways cruelty could never have been. What shook them most was not the abundance, but the normality of it all. The Americans were not celebrating. They were not taunting. This was not a feast meant to impress. This was simply how Americans ate. On a Tuesday, without thought. Here were men who had fought ferociously across the Pacific, who had been told that Japan was the greatest nation on earth, that Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. They had been taught America was decadent, hollow, weak, starving, on the brink of collapse. Yet in captivity they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the empire. The shame was sharp, shame at having been captured, shame at being alive, shame at enjoying the food despite themselves, but the relief was sharper still, a biological imperative that overwhelmed ideology. By the time trays were emptied and bottles stood drained on tables, prisoners sat back in silence. Some folded their hands as if in prayer, perhaps asking forgiveness from the emperor or ancestors for this moment of weakness. Others stared blankly at walls, trying to process what had just happened, not just the meal, but what it meant. The mess hall guards called for order, ushering men back to barracks. Prisoners filed out, still stunned, still whispering despite orders for silence. Their bodies felt different already, the beginning of satiation, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost uncomfortable. That night, lying on bunks under wool blankets, the memory of hamburger and Coca-Cola stayed with them, not just as food, but as proof. Proof that their enemy lived in a different world, one where sweetness could be wasted on prisoners, one where meat was so common it could be shaped into patties and handed out without thought, one where carbonated sugar water came in glass bottles and was drunk casually. But food was only the beginning. Once the routines of daily life inside Camp McCoy took hold, prisoners would face new challenges that tested everything they thought they knew. Daily life, the weight of contradiction. The shock of that first meal lingered like a physical presence, but it did not erase the reality of captivity. Each morning, prisoners woke to roll call echoing across the compound, boots crunching in frost, rifles pointed from guard towers, barbed wire always there, cutting across the horizon. Inside the wire, routine ruled everything. After breakfast, which continued to shock with its abundance, oatmeal with sugar, toast with butter, sometimes eggs and bacon, prisoners were divided into work groups. Some shoveled snow from roads, others cut wood for stoves. Still others were transported under guard to nearby farms where they helped with tasks that didn't directly support the war effort, repairing fences, clearing drainage ditches, general maintenance. The work was steady but not brutal. This surprised men who had expected to be worked to exhaustion. They worked 8-hour shifts with breaks. Guards monitored but didn't drive them like slaves. And most surprisingly, they were paid small wages and camp coupons. The existence of the canteen was another shock. Inside a small building, shelves held items that seemed impossible. Soap, toothpaste, writing paper, combs, and luxuries, candy bars, cigarettes, chewing gum. One afternoon, Private Hayashi stood in the canteen holding a chocolate bar he had purchased with work coupons. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. "In Japan," he murmured to a fellow prisoner, "this is medicine. This is what officers might receive as special rations. Here they give it away to soldiers, to prisoners, like it is nothing." His friend shook his head slowly, unable to articulate a response. The canteen was a window into another world. Prisoners watched American soldiers come and go, buying Coca-Cola or chewing gum, joking about the weather. Their ease, their casualness was almost unbearable. War was raging across 2 oceans, yet here in Wisconsin, Americans seemed to live as though abundance would never run dry. As days accumulated into weeks, the daily structure began to press down differently. There was no fighting, no advancing, no dying comrades to bury. Instead, there was monotony. Wake, work, eat, sleep. The mind, once consumed by survival, now had space to wander. And with wandering came longing that was almost worse than hunger. Letters became lifelines. The camp allowed each prisoner to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, heavily censored but precious. Men hunched over tables, scratching out words with pencils, trying to tell families they were alive without revealing how well they were treated. "I am alive and unharmed" became standard. "I hope you are well. I think of home constantly." What they couldn't write: "I eat meat every day. I have gained weight. I sleep on a mattress. I am warm. While you starve in ruins, I live better than I did as a soldier." Some received letters back, thin envelopes with kanji written in familiar hands. These were treasured, read until paper disintegrated from handling. Others received nothing for weeks, then months. For those men, silence grew heavier with each mail call. Corporal Tanaka received a letter from his wife that had taken 4 months to arrive. In careful, formal language, barely concealing desperation, she wrote of their children surviving on boiled weeds and scraps of barley. The letter was 4 months old. What had happened since? That night, Tanaka sat in the mess hall smelling roast beef and potatoes, and the guilt was so overwhelming he couldn't eat. He sat with a full tray, untouched, until a guard told him to either eat or dispose of the food. English classes were offered in evenings, taught by Japanese-American interpreters whose existence continued to confuse prisoners. A few curious prisoners attended, repeating words slowly: bread, table, window, thank you. Others scoffed, insisting there was no use learning the enemy's tongue, but even skeptics listened from their bunks, ears unconsciously picking up vocabulary despite ideological resistance. There were moments of unexpected contact. At a work site, a guard once asked, "Do you miss rice?" The interpreter relayed the question. One prisoner, surprised into honesty, laughed bitterly and answered, "Rice is a memory. We have not eaten proper rice in over a year. By the end, we ate anything, roots, grass, insects." When the reply was translated, the young guard grew quiet, perhaps realizing for the first time the extent of deprivation these men had experienced. Not all interactions were gentle. Some guards treated prisoners with coldness, never speaking beyond minimum commands. Their eyes held anger that needed no translation. They had brothers or friends killed by Japanese soldiers, and no Geneva Convention rules could make them forget. Within barracks, tensions flared among prisoners themselves. Some clung fiercely to the idea that Japan would triumph, that these months of captivity would end in victory. These men spoke of secret weapons, of inevitable American collapse. Others, worn down by what they had seen, muttered that defeat was inevitable. They spoke carefully in whispers, but their doubt was corrosive. One night, 2 prisoners argued so loudly guards had to intervene. You dishonor our homeland when you speak of defeat. One shouted, face flushed with anger. The emperor's will cannot be overcome. And you dishonor reason by denying what is before your eyes, the other snapped back, voice edged with desperation. We eat better as prisoners than our families eat in Japan. What does that tell you about which side has strength to continue? The guards silenced them, but tension remained. Yet life also produced small human routines. Prisoners carved wooden toys during free hours, their hands remembering crafts learned in childhood. They played improvised games with dice made from whittled wood. They sat together telling stories of home, not the war, but the time before. Childhood memories, family traditions, regional foods they missed. The smell of the mess hall never ceased to haunt them, but at least it was steady. 3 meals a day, every day, no matter what. That fact alone set this captivity apart from jungle trenches where a meal was never certain. In barracks at night, after lights out, silence often fell quickly. But every so often someone would whisper into the dark, "What do you think your family eats tonight?" The answers never came, just sighs and the shifting of blankets, because everyone knew the answer, and speaking it aloud would make the guilt unbearable. Daily life in Camp McCoy was not freedom. It was not cruelty either. It was something in between, a limbo where survival was certain, but meaning felt elusive, where abundance created guilt rather than gratitude. But the longer they lived within the wire, the more some prisoners began to notice moments of connection, flickering between captor and captive, moments that suggested the enemy might be human in ways propaganda had never admitted. Unexpected humanity, when enemies become something else. For weeks, the camp ran like clockwork. Guards gave orders, prisoners followed, meals came on schedule. The rhythm was predictable, almost dull. But in between those routines, small cracks opened where something unexpected slipped through. Moments of humanity. It often started with language. Few Japanese prisoners spoke English beyond a handful of words, and most Americans knew no Japanese. Orders were given through interpreters or gestures. Yet necessity pushed both sides to improvise. A guard might point at a shovel and bark, "Work." A prisoner, catching the sound, would repeat it awkwardly, "Waku." Soon others did the same, laughing quietly at their own clumsy attempts. One evening during an English class, the instructor wrote family on the chalkboard. He asked for a volunteer to pronounce it. A prisoner stood hesitantly, stared at the word, then said, "Fam-ray." The class burst into laughter, not cruel but genuine. Even the instructor smiled. The prisoner smiled too, his face softening for the first time in weeks. In that instant, labels dissolved momentarily. They weren't captor and captive. They were just men trying to bridge a gap, finding humor in shared difficulty. Food became common ground beyond the mess hall. On rare occasions during work details, guards shared cigarettes with prisoners or offered sticks of chewing gum. The gum baffled many who had never encountered it. One man chewed for a few minutes, enjoying the sweetness, then swallowed it whole. The Americans watching roared with laughter, not malicious, but genuinely amused. They shook their heads, trying to explain through gestures, "No, no, chew, don't swallow." The prisoner, realizing his mistake, looked embarrassed, but then laughed at himself. Soon chewing gum became a small symbol of exchange, a guard offering a stick, a prisoner accepting with a stiff bow. But not all interactions were gentle. On a farm outside camp, an American farmer watched prisoners with eyes that burned with barely controlled rage. When one prisoner bent to pick up a dropped tool, the farmer spat on the ground near his feet, not directly at him, but close enough that contempt was unmistakable. The guard escorting the work crew noticed immediately. He said nothing, but walked closer to the farmer, positioning his body between farmer and prisoners. The tension hung in the cold air, unspoken but raw. The farmer turned away, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear, "Should have left them to starve. My boy died on Guadalcanal. These bastards probably killed him." The moment spread quickly among prisoners when they returned to camp. "Not all Americans follow their rules," one said grimly. "We must never forget that many hate us with good reason." His bunkmate replied thoughtfully, "Of course not. They are men like us. Some will hate, some will not. This is human nature, not unique to any people." Inside the wire, something resembling friendship sometimes grew. A young guard named Miller, barely 20 with a soft Illinois accent, often lingered near the barracks after duty. He seemed lonely, seeking connection even with the enemy he was guarding. Miller carried photographs of his family, and one evening he showed them to prisoners gathered near the fence. He pointed to images, speaking in English they didn't fully understand. "That's my mom, my dad, my two sisters." The prisoners didn't understand words, but understood faces. They understood the pride in his voice. In turn, prisoners traced shapes in the dirt with sticks, sketching crude outlines of houses, villages, landscapes. One drew what was clearly a woman and two small figures, his wife and children. Miller nodded, understanding. He said slowly, pointing to his chest, "Mother, father, sisters." A prisoner touched his own chest and said in Japanese, "Haha, Chichi, Imoto, mother, father, sisters." The words were different, but the concepts were universal. The exchange lasted only moments before another guard ordered Miller to move along. But the seed was planted. They had spoken across the chasm, recognized something fundamental. Families existed on both sides. Love existed on both sides. Still, culture ran deep and suspicion ran deeper. Among prisoners, loyalty to the emperor was not erased by hamburgers or Coca-Cola. Some men whispered warnings against softening. They accused fellow prisoners who attended English classes of betraying their honor. In the dim light of barracks, arguments flared. Was survival worth adaptation? Was learning English practical necessity or betrayal of identity? Did every borrowed word, every moment of laughter with a guard chip away at who they were? One prisoner wrote secretly in his diary, hiding the journal under his mattress. "We were told Americans were animals without culture or honor, yet they share their food, they heal our wounds, they follow their laws even when those laws protect their enemies. Which is the lie? Which is the truth? And what does it mean that I can no longer tell?" The contradictions gnawed at him and many others. For some, the kindness of guards felt like humiliation, a reminder that they lived better as captives than their families did in Japan. Each meal, each warm night, each moment of casual humanity emphasized the shameful reality. For others, those same moments hinted at something uncomfortable but undeniable. The enemy was not faceless, not fundamentally different. They were men, some kind, some cruel, most simply trying to do their jobs. One snowy night, as lights flickered out and barracks settled into darkness, a prisoner whispered to his bunkmate, "If we survive this war and return to Japan, what will we tell our children? That our enemy fed us? That he gave us blankets? That he smiled at us when we mispronounced his language?" The bunkmate stayed silent for a long time, the only sounds the wind outside and breathing of sleeping men. Finally, he answered softly, "We will tell them the truth, even if it shames us, because lies poison everything they touch. The truth is complicated, but it is still the truth. But truth was complicated, and it became more complicated as winter turned to spring and news from outside began filtering into Camp McCoy. The end when everything falls apart. By the summer of 1945, the world outside Camp McCoy had shifted in ways that penetrated even the isolated routine of the prison camp. Whispers turned to rumors. Rumors turned to reports carried in newspapers that guards sometimes left where prisoners could glimpse them. The news was uniformly bad for Japan. Germany had surrendered in May, ending the war in Europe and freeing vast military resources to focus entirely on Japan. Cities in Japan were burning under systematic firebombing: Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe. The names filtered through in fragments, each one representing thousands of dead civilians and hundreds of thousands homeless. Then, in early August, came news so strange that many prisoners initially dismissed it as rumor or propaganda. Two cities, Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, had been destroyed by single bombs. The descriptions made no sense. Explosions bright as the sun, mushroom clouds visible for miles. Destruction that exceeded anything conventional weapons could achieve. Most prisoners did not fully understand what an atomic bomb was. The physics were beyond their education, the technology beyond their imagination. But the horror of it bled through every word, every hushed conversation between guards that prisoners overheard. Cities destroyed instantly, tens of thousands dead in moments. Survivors suffering from strange sickness caused by invisible poison, Radiation, though few prisoners knew that word. Then came the truth they could not ignore, could not rationalize away, could not dismiss as enemy propaganda. Japan had surrendered. The announcement fell over Camp McCoy like a weight no one could lift. On August 15, 1945, a gathering was called. Guards assembled prisoners in the main yard. Through interpreters, prisoners were informed that Emperor Hirohito had addressed the Japanese people via radio, an unprecedented event in itself, announcing acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over. Japan had lost. The emperor himself had spoken the words. Some prisoners stared blankly at the ground, their faces empty of expression, minds unable to process what they were hearing. The emperor, divine, infallible, eternal, had announced surrender. The concept was almost incomprehensible, as though someone had announced that gravity no longer worked, or that the sun would not rise tomorrow. Others wept openly, their shoulders shaking under thin summer uniforms, making no effort to hide tears that flowed from despair rather than relief. Some wept for the defeat itself. Others wept for comrades who had died for a cause that had now officially failed. Still others wept simply because they didn't know what else to do with the overwhelming emotion. A few shouted in anger or denial. It couldn't be true. It was American lies. The emperor would never surrender. This was enemy propaganda designed to break their spirits. But even those who denied it loudest knew in their hearts that denial was futile. The interpreters were Japanese Americans, not white soldiers who might lie. The details were too specific, too consistent to be fabricated. For years, these men had carried the belief that their nation could not fall, that death was preferable to defeat, that the emperor's divine protection would ensure ultimate victory regardless of temporary setbacks. They had been taught that the Japanese spirit was unconquerable, that material disadvantage could be overcome through will and sacrifice, that surrender was literally unthinkable, a concept that didn't exist in the vocabulary of Japanese warriors. Now defeat had arrived while they were behind barbed wire, thousands of miles from their homeland, unable to lift a weapon or make a final stand or choose death over dishonor. They had survived when they should have died, lived when they should have perished with honor, eaten hamburgers and drunk Coca-Cola while their nation collapsed into ruins. The shame was crushing, almost physical in its intensity. Many felt they had failed not just as soldiers, but as Japanese men. They had survived instead of dying, had accepted captivity instead of suicide, had grown comfortable, even healthy, in enemy hands while their country burned and their families starved. What right did they have to live when so many had died? What honor remained to men who had eaten well while children starved? Days passed in strange quiet. The routines continued, roll call, meals, work assignments, but everything felt hollow now, drained of meaning. The guards did not gloat, did not celebrate their victory in front of the prisoners. They simply carried on with the procedures, perhaps understanding that rubbing salt in wounds would serve no purpose. For many prisoners, that steadiness was unbearable. "They treat us the same," one man whispered bitterly to his bunkmate, his voice thick with incomprehension. "Whether we are warriors of a mighty empire or defeated remnants of a lost cause, do they not see our shame? Do they not understand what this means to us?" But Americans didn't understand, not fully, not at the level of cultural shame and honor that Japanese prisoners felt. The Americans were relieved the war was over, glad they wouldn't have to invade Japan and face the casualties such an invasion would have caused, grateful that the killing would finally stop. They treated the prisoners exactly as they had before, because nothing had changed in terms of legal obligations under the Geneva Convention. Defeated enemies still had rights. The rules still applied. If anything, some guards seemed more sympathetic after the surrender, recognizing that these men had lost everything and would soon face the difficult task of returning to a devastated homeland. The camp immediately began preparing for repatriation. Red Cross officials arrived with new paperwork, organizing lists, establishing transportation routes, coordinating with various authorities about schedules and logistics. Prisoners were given thorough medical checkups to ensure they were healthy enough to travel, ironic given that they were healthier now than when they'd arrived. They were issued clean uniforms for the journey, proper shoes, even given small packages of food for the ship voyage home. Briefings explained what would happen. They would be shipped back across the Pacific on transport vessels, processed through reception centers in Japan, then released to make their own way home to whatever remained of their families and communities. They were warned that Japan was in ruins, that food was scarce, that the occupation by American forces was beginning. They were told to expect hardship. The preparations felt surreal. Many prisoners couldn't believe they would actually return home. Some didn't want to. They feared what they would find, feared the shame they would face, feared confronting families who had suffered unimaginable hardship while they had been relatively comfortable. How could they look their wives in the eye? How could they explain to their children that they had survived and even thrived while the children had starved? On the morning of the transfer, prisoners filed out of their barracks for the last time, carrying small bundles of belongings. Some clutched wooden carvings they had made during idle hours, toys whittled for children they hadn't seen in years, or small sculptures that represented nothing but the need to create something with their hands, to prove they still existed as individuals rather than just numbers in a prison camp. Others carried carefully folded letters from home, stained with tears and sweat, creased from endless rereading, the paper worn thin from being handled. A few had notebooks where they'd written journals or poetry, trying to capture experiences that defied easy explanation. As they passed through the gates of Camp McCoy for the last time, many glanced back. It was not fondness that moved them. Not exactly. It was confusion, a need to fix in memory this place that had defied all their expectations. The place where they had expected cruelty had instead given them hamburgers, Coca-Cola, heated barracks, medical care, and even glimpses of kindness from men they'd been taught to hate. They had been fed better here than many had eaten in their entire adult lives. They had gained weight in captivity while their families lost it in freedom. They had slept warm while their cities burned. They had learned that their enemy was not the monster propaganda had promised, but simply men, some kind, some cruel, most just doing their jobs. The contradiction would follow them home like a shadow they could never shake, like a ghost that would haunt every meal for the rest of their lives. The legacy: what kindness reveals about war. In the years that followed Japan's surrender and the prisoners' return home, a few former POWs spoke cautiously about their time in America when asked directly. They admitted, usually in private conversations rather than public forums, that they had been treated humanely, that the Americans had followed the Geneva Convention rules, that they had been fed adequately, more than adequately in fact, and housed properly. Some even admitted in very private conversations with trusted friends that the treatment had forced them to see their enemy not as monsters, but as men, men with families and homes and faith and honor, just expressed in different ways. Others never spoke at all about their time in captivity, burying the memories under layers of duty and silence and the hard work of rebuilding lives in a devastated nation. The shame of having survived while others died, of having eaten well while families starved, was too great to articulate even to themselves. Better to say nothing, to lock those memories away, than to try to explain contradictions that made no sense even decades later. One former prisoner, interviewed in the 1980s when time had softened some of the pain and when Japan had rebuilt into an economic powerhouse, tried to explain what the experience had meant to him. Camp McCoy taught me that the world was not what I had been told my entire life. Japan was not the center of all things, not the greatest nation destined to rule Asia. Americans were not barbarians without culture or honor. Abundance was real, not propaganda or temporary wealth that would collapse. But that knowledge came at a terrible price, the price of everything I had believed about myself, my country, my purpose. The hamburger and Coca-Cola broke something inside me that could never be repaired. They showed me a truth I was not ready to accept, that we had lost the war long before we surrendered because we were fighting an enemy who could feed prisoners lavishly while we could not feed our own people. That is a truth that haunts me still. The legacy of Camp McCoy and the hundreds of other POW camps across America during World War II is not found in battles or victories, but in those quiet, disorienting moments when food, kindness, and order collided with fear, hatred, and loyalty. The story of Japanese prisoners fed hamburgers and Coca-Cola reveals uncomfortable truths about war, about humanity, about the power of abundance to break spirits more effectively than cruelty ever could. For the prisoners who survived and returned to Japan, captivity revealed something they had not been prepared to see. Humanity could exist even in the middle of war. Enemies could show mercy. Rules could be followed even when they protected the powerless. Abundance could be so extreme that it was wasted on prisoners without thought or calculation. These revelations were devastating precisely because they contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught from childhood. They had been raised to believe that Japanese culture was superior, that Japanese spirit and determination would overcome material disadvantage, that the emperor's divine favor would ensure victory regardless of temporary setbacks. They had been told repeatedly through propaganda that Americans were decadent, weak, barbaric, and without honor, a mongrel nation of immigrants without culture or soul. Camp McCoy, with its hamburgers and Coca-Cola, its heated barracks and professional medical care, its guards who sometimes showed unexpected kindness, and its rules that actually mattered and were actually enforced, destroyed those comfortable lies. It forced prisoners to confront the reality that they had been deceived by their own leaders, that they had been sent to fight a war Japan could never win against an enemy whose industrial and agricultural capacity was so overwhelming that feeding prisoners lavishly was routine rather than generous, normal rather than exceptional. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. Physical torture can be endured, can even be worn as a badge of honor, can become proof of enemy barbarity that validates one's own cause and suffering. But kindness, abundance, being fed better as a prisoner than as a soldier, being treated more humanely by your enemy than by your own officers, these things undermine the entire narrative of righteous struggle against evil enemies. They force uncomfortable questions that have no good answers. If the enemy treats us humanely, what does that say about the propaganda that portrayed them as monsters? If we eat better in captivity than in freedom, what does that say about our nation's ability to provide for its people? If American privates eat daily what Japanese officers eat rarely, what does that say about which side has the strength to continue? The hamburger became a symbol, not just of American material abundance, but of the unbridgeable gulf between propaganda and reality, between what Japanese soldiers had been told and what actually existed. Every bite was evidence that the world was not what they had been taught. Every sip of Coca-Cola was proof that America's material superiority was real and overwhelming, not invented propaganda or temporary advantage. For many prisoners, this knowledge was harder to carry than hatred or torture scars would have been. Cruelty you can fight against. Cruelty confirms your enemy's barbarity and validates your resistance. Cruelty gives you something to hate, something to blame for your suffering. But kindness undermines everything. It suggests that maybe your enemy isn't evil after all. Maybe your cause wasn't as righteous as you believed. Maybe you've been fighting and suffering and watching friends die for leaders who lied to you about fundamental realities. Perhaps that is the final lesson worth remembering from Camp McCoy and the story of Japanese POWs fed hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Wars end, nations rise and fall, empires collapse, and new ones emerge, but the small choices, a guard sharing a photograph of his family, a child offering candy without hatred, a cook sliding a hamburger across a counter without contempt, can leave marks that outlast the noise of cannons and the grand strategies of generals. These small acts of humanity, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of camps, created a record that propaganda could never fully erase. They demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, even between enemies who had killed each other by the millions, humanity could still exist if people chose to let it. The Japanese prisoners who returned home carried with them memories of hamburgers and Coca-Cola that haunted them more than battle scars. They carried the taste of enemy food, the warmth of enemy blankets, the unexpected humanity of enemy guards who sometimes smiled or shared cigarettes or helped them up when they stumbled, and they carried the uncomfortable knowledge that their survival had depended entirely on the mercy of men they had been taught from childhood to hate without question. As former prisoner Corporal Tanaka told his son many years later, when age and distance had made brutal honesty possible, I learned in America that kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Cruelty you can fight against. Cruelty confirms that your enemy is evil and your cause is just. Cruelty gives you something clear to hate. But kindness? Kindness forces you to see your enemy as human, as someone with a mother and father and children, as someone who could have killed you but chose not to, as someone who followed rules even when those rules protected you. And once you see your enemy as human, truly human, not abstractly but concretely in the specific kindness of specific moments, war becomes much more complicated than anyone wants to admit. The hamburger and Coca-Cola were more effective weapons than any bomb because they destroyed not our bodies but our certainty. And without certainty, what is a soldier but a man who has killed and suffered for reasons he can no longer fully believe in? War can strip men of everything: homes, families, health, hope, future, identity. But it cannot erase the power of small acts of humanity to complicate hatred, to blur the clean lines between friend and enemy, to reveal that beneath uniforms and flags and propaganda and nationalist ideology, men are simply men everywhere, seeking food and warmth and meaning and connection in a world that often provides none of those things easily. The prisoners of Camp McCoy learned that lesson in the most unexpected way possible. Through a paper tray holding a hamburger, fried potatoes, and a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. They learned it not through speeches or ideology or propaganda, but through the direct evidence of their own senses, their own taste buds, their own bodies responding to abundant nourishment after extended starvation. And that perhaps is the story worth remembering and telling, not because it makes anyone feel comfortable or proud, but because it reveals fundamental truths about war, humanity, and the power of abundance to break spirits more effectively than deprivation ever could. The Japanese prisoners who tasted American food in 1945 returned to Japan carrying knowledge that would shape the rest of their lives. The knowledge that the enemy was not what they had been told, that the world was infinitely larger and more complex than propaganda had admitted, and that sometimes the greatest weapons in war are not the ones that kill, but the ones that force you to question everything you thought you knew about yourself, your nation, your enemy, and the meaning of the suffering you've endured.